What if the one you laughed at was the only one awake, not spiritually enlightened, not wise in the way sages are, but awake in the most painful sense, unable to sleep, unable to dream, unable to escape the sound of his own heartbeat pounding against palace walls that never listened? He wore a hat with bells, not a crown. He was given no sword, only words. But those words could cut deeper than steel if anyone dared to listen. He wasn't the king, or the general, or the priest. He was the fool. But here's the secret: in every ancient court, the fool was the only one allowed to speak the truth. And sometimes, the truth is the heaviest thing in the room. So tonight, we're not telling a bedtime story. We're lifting the mask of comedy to reveal the face of sorrow beneath. We're speaking for the ones history laughed at and then erased. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. No child grows up dreaming of becoming a fool. No little boy whispers into the night, "One day I'll wear a hat with bells and dance for those who hold the whip." No little girl hunched beside a fire thinks, "I hope they laugh at me until I forget how to cry." And yet, throughout history, some were born into exactly that fate. They didn't choose the costume. The costume chose them. In the courts of kings, behind golden goblets and velvet drapes, the fool was never simply a man or a woman. The fool was a symbol, a living artifact, a necessary distortion, a walking contradiction, both sacred and mocked, both listened to and never truly heard. The court jester wasn't hired. He was discovered, found among the rejected, the deformed, the overly clever, the dangerously witty, or perhaps worst of all, the ones who couldn't hide their pain with silence. Many were brought into the court because they were strange. A crooked back, a stunted growth, a stammer turned comedic, a face that made noblemen laugh before the first joke was told. Some were orphans, street performers, or outcasts pulled from the gutters and painted in joy like broken statues, repurposed as decoration. A few were born to noble families, but disgraced their only remaining value being the ability to amuse those more powerful. The world didn't ask, "Would you like to be the joke?" It whispered instead, "You will be safe, but only if you remain entertaining." That was the unspoken contract, because the fool was not just entertainment. He was a pressure valve, a human release system. When the king was angry, the fool absorbed it. When the queen was insulted, the fool turned it into rhyme. When the people rebelled, the fool distracted them with dance. He was the soul of the kingdom, forced to contort itself until the pain became palatable. And here's what no one tells you. Being the fool is not just humiliating, it's exhausting, because the mask never comes off. A soldier can remove his armor. A priest can hang up his robes. A king can close the court and be alone. But the fool is the only one who must keep smiling even when no one's looking. He is not allowed grief, not permitted fatigue. His value depends entirely on performance. And in that way, he is not a person, but a product. What happens to a soul forced to smile every time it wants to scream? What happens to a body denied the dignity of stillness? What happens to a human being whose worth is measured only in laughter? They call it the fool's freedom, but that's the cruelest lie of all. Yes, the jester could say things no one else dared, but it came at a cost. The fool could never be taken seriously, never be loved without caution, never stop dancing, because if he did, he was no longer amusing. And if he was no longer amusing, he was no longer safe. In some courts, Jesters were executed for melancholy, for failing to entertain, for pausing too long, for having eyes that carried too much sorrow. One chronicler in the 15th century wrote, "The fool grew quiet, and so they feared him." Let that sink in. A man whose silence was so rare that it was mistaken for rebellion. A woman whose tired expression made nobles whisper, "Does she plot something?" When joy is compulsory, sadness becomes threatening. And when sadness threatens power, power responds the only way it knows how, by removing the threat. That's why the costume matters. The bells on the hat weren't decoration. They were surveillance. You could hear the jester from rooms away. You always knew where they were. The patchwork colors, a reminder that they were assembled, not whole. The shoes with curled tips, they made running impossible. The entire outfit was a cage stitched in thread. It told the court and the fool, you are not a person. You are a punchline. This was not merely fashion. It was control. It was the art of disarming a truth-teller by turning him into a cartoon. You can't be afraid of someone you're laughing at. Right. But the tragedy of the jester wasn't just societal. It was internal. Many learned to laugh at themselves just to survive. They sharpened their wit until it sliced their own dignity. They made jokes about their appearance, their loneliness, their trauma. Because if they made the joke first, no one else could weaponize it. They were masters of preemptive humiliation. And still behind the jokes, many of them didn't sleep. Insomnia, sadness, nightmares, trembling hands. These weren't just signs of illness. They were evidence of a spirit stretched too thin across too many expectations. The fool might have been awake longer than anyone else in the palace, because the weight of laughter is heaviest when you're carrying it alone. So when you imagine a court jester, don't just picture the dancing, the tumbling, the jokes. Picture the moment after the crowd leaves. Picture the silence. Picture the mask unpeeled. And ask yourself, did anyone ever ask him how he felt? Did anyone ask her if she wanted to perform that day? Or were they just too good at pretending no one chooses to be a fool? The world chooses them, and then it punishes them for being exactly what it needed. They say the performance ends when the curtain falls. But for the fool, there is no curtain. There is no backstage. There is no off. You don't get to stop performing when your entire identity has been welded to the sound of other people's laughter. The role of the jester didn't end when the king dismissed the crowd. It didn't pause when the candles were snuffed out, or when the nobles retired to their velvet chambers. No, the performance followed the fool into the hallways, into the kitchens, into the private corners of the castle, where shadows were supposed to offer mercy. Even there he was watched. Even there she was expected to spark joy. Because when a person is branded as entertainment, silence becomes suspicious. Fatigue becomes defiance. Stillness becomes a threat. The fool was not just expected to perform during ceremonies or banquets. They were expected to embody the role every waking hour. If they appeared sad, why so quiet, fool? If they walked too fast, what are you plotting, jester? If they dared to cry, have you forgotten your purpose? To be sad was to betray the kingdom. To be tired was to fail your function. Because here's the hidden rule behind every smile they wore. If you're not laughing, you might be planning rebellion. That's not a metaphor. In some kingdoms, it was literally law. Records show jesters arrested, exiled, or even executed for falling into melancholy. In the 16th century court of a northern monarch, one fool was dismissed for long silences and frequent stares into the fire. Another was flogged for muttering verses that weren't amusing enough. One female jester was interrogated after a noble accused her of looking too serious during a royal procession. That's the cruelty of being the funny one. No one asks what's underneath. The moment you show pain, people feel betrayed, as if your sadness is a personal inconvenience to their comfort. And the worst part, many jesters began to believe it. They internalized the demand, turned performance into personality. Laughter became armor and addiction. They'd smile through funerals. They'd dance through heartbreak. Because somewhere along the line, the audience's needs became more important than their own. You might know someone like that today. The person who makes everyone laugh, but never lets anyone close. The one who fills the room with jokes, but can't sleep through the night. The friend who always says, "I'm fine," even when their eyes say otherwise. Maybe it's you. Maybe you learned early on that if you weren't useful, you weren't safe. That if you stopped smiling, the love would disappear. That silence was dangerous, not because of what it meant, but because of what it revealed. Because silence reveals the truth. And sometimes the truth is, you're tired. Not just physically, existentially. Tired of performing. Tired of proving. Tired of having to be the strong one, the funny one, the okay one. And yet, like the court fool, you keep performing. Because it feels safer to be applauded than to be truly seen. Carl Jung once wrote that the persona, the mask we wear in public, becomes so fused to our identity that we forget it's not our true face. The jester lived that truth every day, and in many ways, so do we. We laugh to survive. We shrink our sadness into sarcasm. We repackage our fear as wit. We smother our anger in irony. Because we were taught that honesty makes people uncomfortable, and being uncomfortable makes you expendable. So we keep performing, even after the crowd has gone home. We perform for our bosses, for our lovers, for our families, for our social media feeds, for the ghost of the parent who never hugged us right, for the echo of a teacher who only praised us when we achieved. We smile on command. We swallow tears. We answer, "How are you?" with "I'm good," even when everything inside us is unraveling. Because the world doesn't reward truth, it rewards performance. But what happens when the performance becomes too heavy? What happens when the bells on your hat ring louder than your heartbeat? What happens when you forget the sound of your own voice beneath the laughter? That's where the danger lies. Not in being a fool, but in never being allowed to be anything else. Because when you're always performing, you begin to wonder if there's a real self left beneath the costume. You begin to fear that if you take off the mask, there will be nothing. No identity, no worth, no applause, just silence. But maybe that silence isn't emptiness. Maybe it's the beginning of truth. Maybe the fool, the one who danced for survival, is also the one who holds the key to healing. Not through more laughter, but through the courage to stop performing, to stop pretending, to sit in stillness and say, "I don't want to be amusing today. I don't want to entertain you right now. I just want to be." That is the most radical act a fool can commit to reclaim their humanity, to exist outside the expectations of others, to find sacredness in silence, not as punishment, but as homecoming. And maybe that's the invitation for all of us, to become more than the roles we've performed, to risk disappointing others in order to tell the truth, to remove the hat with bells and listen for the first time to what's underneath, Because your soul doesn't want an audience. It wants a witness. And maybe, just maybe, you can be that witness for yourself. Before they ever heard your voice, before you ever spoke a word, they dressed you. The jester's costume wasn't chosen. It was assigned. Bright colors, mismatched patterns, dangling bells on the hat, exaggerated shoes, a cane shaped like your own face, all carefully designed not to elevate your presence, but to erase your dignity. The message was clear. You are not a man. You are not a woman. You are a spectacle, not a soul with a name, but a joke in human form. In many medieval courts, these costumes were mandatory, enforced like military uniform. The louder, the better. The more humiliating, the more effective. Because it wasn't enough to make you perform like a fool. You had to look like one too. The fool's hat, often a tri-cornered cap, with bells symbolized the donkey ears of mockery. The shoes curled upward, as if to trip over themselves. The colors clashed intentionally. Red and yellow, the tones of fire and sickness. Greens and purples, garish and childlike. These were not garments of celebration. They were visual chains. To walk into a room wearing that costume was to announce, I am beneath you. And that was the point. No one in court had to say it aloud. They only needed to glance your way and chuckle. The bells would do the rest, a cruel symphony, announcing your arrival before your voice ever had a chance to be heard. You were not allowed to blend in. You were not allowed to disappear. You were not allowed to be neutral. You were forced to be visible and then mocked for existing. It's hard to explain how violence can hide in something as seemingly innocent as fabric, but that's the sinister genius of the jester's costume. It dressed up oppression as entertainment. And here's the most painful part. Eventually, many jesters began to believe the costume was who they were. This is where Carl Jung's insight into the persona becomes deeply relevant. The persona, the mask we wear to survive in society, is necessary. It protects us. It helps us function. But when the persona becomes fused to our identity, we forget it's a mask. We confuse the costume for the soul. The jester's outfit was never just a garment. It was a psychological weapon, a way to control behavior through shame. You don't speak up when you're dressed like a clown. You don't ask for respect in mismatched shoes. You don't grieve or rage or dream when your very appearance is designed to remind you and everyone else that you're not real. You are other. You are less. You are here for them. Many modern people still wear these costumes, not made of fabric, but of expectation. The woman who's told to dress more feminine, so she'll be taken seriously. The boy who's mocked for wearing pink or crying in public. The non-conforming soul who's forced to shrink polish or edit themselves just to survive the day. These are costumes too. Invisible perhaps, but just as dehumanizing. You may not have bells on your shoes, but if you've ever dressed in a way to please the crowd, if you've ever hidden your real self because it made others uncomfortable, you know what it feels like to carry the jester's burden. And the worst part, they call it a choice. They say, well, you chose to wear that. You chose this role. You chose to be this way. But the jester didn't choose to be born with a hunched back, didn't choose to be neurodivergent or epileptic or too loud or too clever, didn't choose to be funny as a survival reflex, didn't choose to be noticed and then punished for it. They were chosen by a society that needed someone to laugh at, chosen to carry the collective discomfort so the rest of the court could feel normal. And so are many of us. We're chosen to play roles we didn't audition for. The responsible one, the pretty one, the funny one, the quiet one, the strong one. And the longer we wear the mask, the more we forget that it's not our face. But here's the truth. Most people never hear. You were never your costume. Not the hat, not the heels, not the makeup or the muscles, or the fake smile, not the persona you built to survive, not the voice you lowered, not the sparkle you dimmed, not the version of yourself you crafted so that others would accept you. The real you, the soul beneath the costume, has always been sacred, always been worthy, even when it was laughed at, especially when it was laughed at. The fool's costume was never a reflection of who they were. It was a projection of what the world needed them to be. But now, you can step out of it. You can take off the hat, let the bells fall silent, feel the weight of your own skin, again not as decoration, but as truth. You can remember what it feels like to wear nothing but yourself. No mask, no role, just breath, and presence, and freedom. Because true healing begins not when the costume is perfected, but when it's removed. And in the quiet that follows, when no one is clapping, when no one is watching you, might hear a voice you haven't heard in years. I'm still here, and I never needed to be funny. They clapped when you spoke, they laughed when you danced, but they never looked you in the eyes long enough to ask, "How are you?" Really? Because that would mean acknowledging something dangerous. That would mean admitting you were more than a tool, more than a court plaything. It would mean admitting you were human. But in the medieval court, a jester was not a person. He was a function. His job, to amuse, to entertain, to lighten the mood of kings who crushed rebellions and queens who smiled through poison, to make the unbearable bearable by making it absurd. But what happened when the jester didn't feel funny? What if he was tired, or grieving, or angry? There was no space for that, no room for his real feelings, because the moment he stopped performing, he stopped being useful. And if you're not useful to the powerful, you're disposable. They didn't see a man who could bleed, or a woman who could cry. They saw a talking object, a living prop, a machine designed to produce laughter on command. Sadness was seen as malfunction. Silence was seen as threat. If you weren't smiling, the king might wonder, is he plotting something? Because in a system built on control, even a moment of real human emotion feels like rebellion. So, the jester learned to hide it. He learned to smile even when his teeth hurt, to laugh even when he wanted to scream, to tell jokes at funerals, to mock himself before others could. Because if he didn't, the consequences could be deadly. And maybe that's what hurts most. Not just the forced laughter, but the way people wanted you to hurt just enough to stay funny, but not enough to make them uncomfortable. Pain became performance. This too is what Carl Jung would call shadow suppression, the violent splitting of the self to survive. You exile the parts of you that are inconvenient, the anger, the grief, the fear. You bury them so deep you forget they were ever yours. And the tragedy is, they don't disappear. They fester. They show up in dreams, in body aches, in quiet moments when the mask slips. And one day they come flooding out, not as tears, but as silence so heavy, it crushes the spirit. If you've ever been expected to perform while you were in pain, you understand this. If you've ever had to smile through trauma crack jokes to keep the peace or lighten the mood when you were falling apart inside, you've played the fool too. Many of us still live this way. We go to work with anxiety clenched in our stomachs. We show up to family dinners pretending everything is fine. We say I'm okay when our hearts are breaking, because we've been taught that honesty makes us burdens. So we shrink, we smile, we make ourselves easy to digest, until we don't recognize ourselves in the mirror, anymore just a performance, polished for other people's comfort. But what if we stopped? What if we stopped asking, was that funny enough? And started asking, was that true enough? What if we dared to be real, even if it cost us applause? Because here's the secret. No one tells the fool, you are more than what you do for others. You are more than your usefulness, more than your humor, more than your role. You are a living, feeling, sacred being with joy that doesn't need to be loud and grief that deserves to be honored. And the moment you stop performing, the moment you say, I don't feel like being funny today, that is not weakness. That is a sacred act of rebellion. It is the moment the object becomes human again. The moment the puppet grows a spine. The moment the mask falls off and underneath is a face that never needed to be anything but itself. So, if you're tired of being the one who always keeps things light, if you're exhausted from dancing on command, if you long to be seen for more than your role, then hear this. You were never meant to be a talking object. You were always meant to be a voice, a breath, a presence. You don't owe anyone your smile. You don't owe the world a performance. You don't need to be useful to be worthy. You just need to be real. And in a world that rewards masks, that's the bravest thing you can be. He spoke in riddles. He laughed too loud. He twisted truth into punchlines and wisdom into nonsense. But the wise knew the joke was never just a joke, because in every ancient court, the jester played a dangerous game. He made the king laugh, while quietly slipping truth past his guards. He wasn't just there to entertain. He was there to smuggle in reality disguised in comedy. It was survival, a shield, a secret code only the brave or broken could decipher. Imagine this. You are surrounded by men who can have you beheaded for speaking too plainly. The queen is unfaithful. The army is starving. The taxes are breaking backs in the village below. But you cannot say that. So instead, you step into the court. You juggle 3 rotten apples and whisper, my liege, perhaps the orchard is sick, the fruit is spoiled, the air too thin. But what do I know? I'm just a fool with a bellyache and a sense of smell. The room erupts in laughter. No one notices the tension in the air, the flicker in the king's eyes. But somewhere in the shadows, a minister hears the message. He knows what you mean. Everyone does, because the truth, when spoken outright, demands action. But when hidden in a joke, it can pass through unchecked. This is the genius and tragedy of the jester. He had to lie in order to tell the truth. Carl Jung once said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. The jester knew this too. He knew that truth, when served raw, was too bitter for the court to swallow. But if you dress it in laughter, if you twist it with irony, they might just accidentally digest it, because the joke is safe, the joke is harmless, until it isn't. History is full of these jokes. Clever one-liners that disguised revolutions, witty insults that exposed corruption, puns that punched upwards. The Greeks called it parrhesia, speaking truth to power, even when it costs you everything. But the jester had to be subtler than that. He had no army, no title, just a mouth and a mask. So he became fluent in double meanings. He'd say, the rooster with no eggs should crow less, and everyone would laugh at the absurdity. But they knew it was about the duke, the one who fathered no heirs, yet barked orders like a god. The The jester's language was mythic, symbolic. It was the language of dreams and shadows, the same language the unconscious uses according to Jung. Because you can't confront tyranny head-on, but you can dance around it. Mock it just enough to wake people up, but not enough to get yourself killed. He was a tightrope walker over a pit of blades, and yet he kept walking. Why? Because someone had to. Someone had to say what everyone was afraid to think. Someone had to laugh not because things were funny, but because they were unbearable. And someone had to make the king remember, even you can be mocked. Even you are not immune to truth. In this way, the jester wasn't just entertainment, he was sacred. He reminded the kingdom of its shadow. He held up a mirror no one asked for, and made you laugh while seeing your own cracks. And that's what makes his role so tragically powerful, because sometimes the jester told the truth too well. Sometimes his jokes worked. They cut too deep. They woke the wrong people. They humiliated the powerful, and that the court could never forgive. Because laughter is only welcome when it's controlled, when it stays in its lane, when it serves the crown, not questions it. And so the fool would sometimes disappear. One day, he's on stage. The next, he's not. No trial, no record, just silence, the kind that follows when truth dares to speak too clearly. And in that silence, something sacred dies. Because when a society kills the only one allowed to speak truth safely, it tells you everything you need to know about its future. So today we still see jesters. They're not in palaces. They're on stages, in podcasts, behind camera lenses. They speak in comedy, in sarcasm, in satire. They slip truth between jokes, and we laugh nervously, because deep down we know they're right. And maybe, like in ancient times, we don't want to admit it, but the jester's role remains to speak the unbearable, to turn pain into performance, to slip truth through the cracks of our denial, and to remind us the ones we laugh at too quickly are often the only ones still awake. One day the court erupts in laughter. The jester has just compared the queen's hairstyle to a mop dipped in goose grease. Even the king chuckles. He waves his hand indulgent. Let the fool speak. He brings levity to our days. The next day, the same jester makes the same joke. Same voice, same smirk, same goose grease. But this time, silence. The king does not laugh. The queen does not blink. And by morning, the jester is gone. No warning, no trial, just an empty stool, and bells left swinging in the breeze. Because the truth isn't only about what's said, it's about when to whom, and how much. In every court, there was a line that could not be crossed, and worse than crossing it was not knowing where it was. It shifted like fog. Yesterday's clever joke was today's treason. Last week's satire was this week's insult to the crown. The jester lived in a constant game of emotional weather, forecasting, is it safe to laugh today? Or will a storm arrive in silence? It was a terrifying kind of freedom. The king's approval was fickle. A laugh meant survival. A frown meant death. No one told the jester the rules they changed by the hour, and the cost of misreading the room was final. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, the part of the psyche that contains all we deny, suppress, and reject. He said, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. And in royal courts, that shadow was enormous. It stretched across every marble pillar and gold-plated smile. And the jester, he danced right at the edge of it, because he wasn't just making jokes. He was teasing the unconscious, poking at what everyone saw but dared not name. He'd mock the greed of nobles while pouring them wine. He'd parody the tax collectors while wearing their coins in his bells. He was both part of the system and its mirror. But what happens when the mirror reflects too clearly? That's when fear replaces laughter, because truth has a funny way of getting louder once it's heard. And those in power don't fear noise. They fear recognition. They fear the moment when the joke stops being funny and starts being real. So the jester walked a tightrope every day. No net, no applause if he fell. He had to know exactly how much truth to tell. Too little, and he was useless. Too much, and he was a threat. And here's the irony. He was often punished not for lying, but for telling too much truth, too soon. You see, people say they want honesty, but they want it gently. They want it in doses. They want it wrapped in sugar and served on a tray, not hurled like a stone through stained glass. But the jester didn't have the luxury of timing. He only had instinct, and when instinct failed, he vanished. In some courts, jesters were blinded. In others, their tongues were cut out. Some were buried in unmarked graves, remembered only in whispers. And their legacy, laughter, yes, but also caution, because they became living proof that truth without armor is dangerous, and worse, lonely. Even today, that lesson remains. How many comedians have crossed the invisible line? How many truth-tellers have been banished for going too far? How many voices are silenced, not because they lied, but because they revealed a truth the crowd wasn't ready for? This is why the jester is not just a symbol of comedy, he's a warning. He reminds us that society's tolerance for truth is conditional. It's permitted, but only when convenient. Celebrated, but only when profitable. Heard, but only if it doesn't shake the foundations. And when it does, the punishment is swift, not just from kings or queens, but from the masses, from the crowd that once cheered, from the audience that now throws stones. So here's the quiet tragedy. The jester's life was spent speaking in masks, and even then, he was never truly safe. He danced at the edge of a blade. He whispered truth, wrapped in humor. He gave us medicine hidden in candy. But he paid the price, because the moment the laughter stopped, the executioner arrived. He was always there, in the shadows of the throne room, at the edge of every feast, every council, every whisper-filled hallway. The jester didn't just perform, he listened. That was his true role. In an age before surveillance, before wiretaps, before microphones tucked behind portraits, there was one presence that captured everything the fool. He was invisible by design. Everyone saw him, yet no one looked at him. He was entertainment, background noise, a living distraction, and that made him the perfect listener. While the nobles plotted, he poured wine. While the king schemed, he tuned his lute. While the queen cried in silence, he heard it. He heard everything, and he remembered. Because in those silences, those tense moments between laughter, the jester became something terrifying, a witness. In royal courts, power wasn't just about force. It was about secrets. Who had them? Who kept them? And most of all, who could expose them? The jester knew the affairs of the queen, the bastard sons of dukes, the midnight murders covered up with gold. He knew the names, the places, the truths that could crumble a dynasty. And that made him the most dangerous man in the room, not because he held a sword, but because he didn't need one. All he had to do was speak. But here's the paradox. The jester was trapped in a gilded paradox. To be useful, he had to know. To survive, he had to pretend he didn't. So he laughed. He danced. He made crude jokes that disarmed suspicion. He spun satire so clever that even those mocked felt flattered. And still he remembered everything. There is a reason why in many ancient traditions, the fool was not just a comic. He was a seer, a trickster, a liminal being who stood at the threshold between what is spoken and what is sacred. Carl Jung would say he carried the archetype of the trickster, the one who lives outside the rules, who breaks the sacred order, not out of malice, but to reveal its rot. But even Jung admitted the trickster walks a dangerous path. Too much truth, and he becomes a threat. Too little, and he becomes irrelevant. The jester had no allies, no power base, no noble family or military protection. His only defense was ambiguity, was laughter, was making people unsure whether he meant what he said or was simply jesting. But what happens when the king begins to suspect the jester is no longer joking, that he's remembering too much, that his eyes are too still, too knowing, that behind the smile there is understanding? That's when the fool becomes the target. In some courts, jesters were quietly removed, sent away with coin and silence. In others, they were retired in more final terms, buried with no name, just bells stuffed in their mouths. Why? Because no king sleeps well, knowing someone has seen them without their mask, and the jester had seen everyone unmasked. He knew which knight wept after battle, which priest stole from the altar, which advisor secretly wanted the crown. And here's the deeper tragedy. The jester saw the humanity behind the power and was punished for it. He knew that every tyrant was once a terrified child, that every queen had tasted betrayal, that even kings have nightmares. But in a system built on illusion, there's no place for someone who sees clearly. So the jester laughed, and laughed, and laughed, while silently carrying the weight of what he could never say, until eventually the weight became too much. Some fools broke down, others vanished. A few became mad, or perhaps pretended to be, just to survive. Because in truth, he wasn't just the court's hidden camera. He was its conscience. And conscience in the wrong room is always unwelcome. Today, we think of fools as clueless, silly, harmless. But once the fool was the one who knew too much, the one whose eyes were open even when others chose to look away. And in every age, ancient or modern, those who see clearly are never safe. While the court jester wore a mask to survive, she wore armor and dared them to strike. Her name was Cynaine, daughter of King Philip II of Macedonia, half-sister of Alexander the Great. But unlike most royal women, she wasn't raised to smile, bow, or charm. She was raised to fight. Cynaine rode horses before she could read, trained with blades while others practiced etiquette. She grew up beside soldiers, not servants. And when other princesses learned courtly grace, she studied warfare. But Cynaine was no mere tomboy. She was a tactician, a leader, a woman who didn't ask to be feared. She simply was. When her husband, a Macedonian general, was killed in battle, she didn't return to court in mourning. She took command of his troops, and they followed her, not because she was royal, but because she was formidable. Cynaine marched into Iria, leading her own battalion, not as a symbol, not as a puppet, but as a commander in full armor, riding into fire. And she won. Her strategy outflanked male generals. Her speeches ignited loyalty. Her very presence embarrassed the men who once mocked her. And that's where her real war began. Because in monarchies, As in many systems, it's not failure that makes you dangerous. It's success. Sinane didn't threaten the empire by losing. She threatened it by winning. A woman commanding men, a mother shaping policy, a princess who moved pieces on the board instead of being one that couldn't be allowed. So they called her reckless, unstable, too emotional, too ambitious. They whispered that she lacked feminine humility, that she overstepped her place. But the truth was simpler. She made them look small, and power doesn't forgive humiliation, especially when it wears a dress. Still, Sinane didn't stop. After Alexander's death, she pushed for her daughter to marry into the royal bloodline. She saw a chance to influence succession, to ensure her family's survival. But court politics is a battlefield where smiles hide daggers, and Sinane wasn't just playing the game, she was rewriting the rules. That terrified them. She was called to a meeting under the guise of diplomacy. Instead, she was ambushed. The men who feared her couldn't defeat her in battle, so they used protocol, signed documents, legal language. But at the end of it all, they did what weak men always do when they face a strong woman. They eliminated her. Some say she was stabbed, others say poisoned. The records disagree, perhaps intentionally. But what they all agree on is this Sinane died not because she failed, but because she dared to lead. And then they erased her. No statues, no tributes, few textbooks, just a name sometimes misspelled, footnoted in dusty margins. But history's silence doesn't mean she was forgotten, because in every girl who grows up too loud, too bold, too brave, Sinane lives. In every woman told she's too much, in every leader denied because of her gender, in every strategist who dares to raise her voice, Sinane echoes. She was a warning to the powerful that women can rule not just in name, but in strength. But she was also a mirror, showing how fragile male power can be when threatened by a woman with purpose. And perhaps that's why they feared her most, because Sinane didn't want to replace men. She wanted to prove she didn't need them to win. And that was her greatest crime. If Sinane was fire, her daughter was the flame that refused to go out. Her name was Eurydice, a name barely spoken in the halls of history, and yet one that burned with silent defiance. She was born into danger, the daughter of a warrior queen, raised in a world where women could bleed in battle, but never lead in peace, where daughters were meant to be political chess pieces, not queens. But Sinane saw differently. She didn't raise a girl, she raised an heir. From childhood, Eurydice was trained not just in swordplay and military discipline, but in command. She wasn't taught how to behave at court. She was taught how to stand in front of an army and be listened to. Where other children played with dolls, she studied maps. While other girls were told to smile, she was taught how to speak with such conviction that men would fall silent. She wore armor that was tailored not to fit a man's body, but her own. Not to imitate masculinity, but to embody power in a feminine form. She was, in every sense, her mother's daughter, but her destiny was darker, because Eurydice didn't just inherit her mother's strength, she inherited her enemies. After Sinane was assassinated, Eurydice became a living reminder of everything the royal court wanted to erase. A lineage of women who led. A bloodline that proved the throne was not only for men, and that made her intolerable. They couldn't silence her, not immediately, so they tried to domesticate her. They offered her strategic marriages, sweetened lies, false alliances. But Eurydice had been raised to read between the lines. She knew when a hand extended in peace held a dagger just out of sight. So, she rejected the role of ornamental queen. She claimed real power, and the soldiers, many of whom had once followed her mother, pledged loyalty to her. She gave speeches in full armor, not just ceremonial words, but commands, not as a princess or consort, but as a sovereign. It was unheard of. A woman standing before an army not to bless it, but to lead it. She didn't just wear the crown, she wielded it. But power, when held by a woman, is never simply power. It's often branded something else. Too ambitious, too masculine, too unnatural. Eurydice was painted by her enemies as a disruption to divine order, as if God himself had forgotten to assign her a husband and corrected the mistake with tragedy. And so, they moved in shadows. Whispers turned to threats. Threats became edicts, until one day, Eurydice the queen, in her own right, was handed a choice death, or dignity, or rather, the illusion of dignity. She was commanded to take her own life, a form of ritualized erasure, a death dressed in ceremony, so her blood wouldn't stain the hands of those too cowardly to kill her openly. We don't know her final words. They were never recorded. But perhaps she said nothing, because her entire life had already spoken too much truth for them to bear. And so she died, alone, erased, a silence where a name should have echoed. No statues, no monuments, no legacy, except in the quiet defiance of those who came after. Because Eurydice, like her mother, did not fail, she succeeded too well. She proved that a woman's command could move armies, that leadership was not a matter of gender, but of fire, and that's the kind of truth that empires cannot tolerate. They did not bury her body. They buried the idea of her, but it didn't work, because every woman told she's too much carries a piece of Eurydice. Every time a girl speaks too loudly, fights too hard, climbs too high, she steps onto the battlefield Eurydice died on. Not to die, but to continue the war. They didn't die because they failed. They died because they succeeded in a world that couldn't bear the weight of their success. The stories of Sinane and Eurydice are not just tales of bravery. They are wounds carved into the flesh of forgotten history. Wounds that never bled publicly. Wounds buried beneath palaces and scrolls. Wounds we were never supposed to remember. Because if we remembered them, we'd have to admit a truth. Most empires are built to deny that women have always led. That female power is not new. It's ancient. And that silencing it has always required violence disguised as virtue. Sinane fought like a general and ruled like a sovereign, but they called her a disturbance. Eurydice commanded armies, but they labeled her unnatural, and so they erased them both, one with a dagger, the other with silence. Together, they form a double tragedy, not because they lost, but because they were never allowed to win. History remembers the conquerors, the kings, the fathers of nations. But what about the mothers who bled for them? What about the women whose only mistake was refusing to shrink Sinan? And Eurydice did not die with swords in their hands. They died with their legacy still burning a fire too bright for the world to look at directly. And that is the second tragedy. The first was their death. The second is our forgetting. They deserved epic poems. They got footnotes. They deserved statues. They got rumors. And yet, here we are centuries later, still speaking their names, even if we whisper them. Why? Because something in us recognizes them. In every woman who is told she's too loud, too ambitious, too emotional, too commanding, there is a flicker of Sinane's armor and Eurydice's refusal to kneel. This isn't just their story. It's our inheritance. It's the reason a girl standing tall can still be seen as a threat. The reason women in power are questioned, tested, doubted not because they're unqualified, but because they dare. And let's be honest, their courage frightens us, because they make us confront a painful truth, that maybe history wasn't written by the victors. Maybe it was written by the survivors. And maybe, just maybe, those survivors left out the women they couldn't control. But here's the twist. The more we speak their names, the harder they are to erase. Sinane, Eurydice, 2 women, 2 flames, 1 legacy. They weren't martyrs. They were mirrors, reflections of what female power looks like when it's not watered down, dressed up, or hidden behind a throne. Raw, unapologetic, unforgivable, only because it could not be contained. So, what do we do with their story? We remember, we reclaim, and we refuse to shrink, because the real tragedy would be to let their deaths mean nothing. But the real victory is this moment. You still listening, still caring, still wondering what other truths history tried to bury. Sinane and Eurydice may have been silenced, but they are not gone. They live on in every woman who refuses to bow. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the sound of their armor, not rusting in some forgotten grave, but echoing through time, waiting for someone brave enough to wear it again. In ancient Greece, truth was too sacred to be spoken directly, so they placed it behind a mask, not to hide it, but to protect it. Because in a society where gods walked among men, where reputation meant survival, and where public honor was currency, the human soul needed a disguise to speak freely, and that disguise was theater. Greek theater wasn't entertainment. It was ritual. It was a dialogue between the mortal and the divine, between the seen and the unseen. Every spring, thousands would gather in open-air amphitheaters to witness the Dionysian festivals, sacred ceremonies dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine chaos and transformation. But make no mistake, this wasn't just about celebration. It was exorcism. Each tragedy performed wasn't merely a story. It was a collective dream, a mirror held up to society, a mask worn so that the unspeakable could finally be spoken. When Oedipus blinded himself, it wasn't just about fate or incest. It was about the cost of truth, the unbearable burden of seeing clearly in a world built on denial. When Antigone buried her brother against the king's decree, it wasn't just rebellion. It was a cry from the feminine mourning justice in a world ruled by masculine law. These plays were not fictional. They were emotionally accurate in a way the real world could not afford to be. The actors wore massive masks, carved wood-painted expressions, open mouths, not to hide their feelings, but to amplify archetypes. The hero, the tyrant, the mother, the madman. By putting on the mask, the actor didn't pretend. They became the symbol, and through them, the audience saw themselves in their rage, in their guilt, in their grief. Because catharsis wasn't a buzzword back then. It was sacred. You didn't go to the theater to forget. You went to remember what society tried to numb. You went to feel the full weight of being human together. You went to cry publicly, purge quietly, and walk home feeling like something inside you had been named, even if just for a moment. And it mattered, because in ancient Greece, there was no therapy. There was only the chorus, that haunting rhythmic voice of collective conscience. They didn't just comment on the play. They whispered your own thoughts back to you through metaphor. When the chorus cried out that fate is inescapable, they were echoing your private dread. When they begged the gods for mercy, They were praying your unspoken prayers. So, what does this tell us that long before podcasts, journals, or self-help books, humans turned to story and symbol to process pain? And the Greeks, wise as they were, understood something we often forget. The truth is too powerful to be delivered without poetry. Because the raw truth can wound, but when sung through the voice of myth, it becomes medicine. And this is why the mask was sacred. It wasn't a lie. It was a key unlocking a part of you didn't know you had locked away. Today we scroll instead of grieve. We binge instead of break down. We consume content instead of confronting our shadows. But in the echo of those ancient amphitheaters, you can still hear a whisper, what you cannot say, you must act. What you cannot show, you must wear. And what you dare not feel, you must embody. This is the wisdom of Greece, that by pretending to be someone else, we often discover the most authentic version of ourselves. So, next time you laugh at someone wearing a mask, ask yourself, what truths have you been too afraid to reveal without one? Because in the end, the Greeks weren't just putting on plays. They were putting on the soul, draped in trauma, dressed in metaphor, speaking the kind of truth that could only survive if no one claimed to own it. And somehow, that made it all the more real. In ancient China, truth was not shouted. It was whispered, through movement. Where the Greeks cried their catharsis into the open air, the Chinese concealed it behind discipline, symbolism, and elegance. No outburst, no blunt confrontation, only stillness, only precision. And somehow it said just as much. Chinese opera, especially Peking opera, was not just a theatrical form, it was a cosmic language. A flick of the wrist could summon a storm. A turn of the ankle could signal heartbreak. A single step might represent 1,000 miles, or the end of a lifetime. There was no need for elaborate sets or detailed props. The stage was almost bare, because the real stage was the body. Every gesture was codified, rehearsed for years. An eye roll was an attitude. It was ancestral. A raised finger was an emphasis. It was a sacred symbol. And a sleeve's flutter wasn't wind. It was the breath of a goddess. This was a theater of restraint and depth, where emotion was embedded within structure, and where chaos had to wear the skin of control. To the Western eye, it might look quiet, even slow, but in that silence lived the storm. Take the character of the Sheng, the noble male. His every movement echoed Confucian ideals, loyalty, integrity, self-mastery, or the Dan, the female role, often played by men for centuries. She wasn't just acting like a woman. She was embodying the divine feminine, a spirit both tender and terrifying, graceful and unyielding. Colors, too, were codes. A red face meant courage, white treachery, black rough justice, gold a deity. Every shade was a story, every detail a declaration. And this is what makes Chinese opera so revolutionary. It treated aesthetic as ethic. How something looked wasn't just style, it was truth. Because to the ancients, how you express is what you express. So why does this matter now? Because we live in a time where expression is noisy, constant chaotic. But in Chinese theater, stillness was the scream. It taught us, you don't have to raise your voice to be heard. You don't have to explain your pain in words. Sometimes, a glance carries the whole wound. This isn't just performance, it's medicine for a noisy soul. In a world addicted to attention, Chinese opera whispered, be intentional, be sacred. Let your silence speak louder than their noise. And it did. When an actor stood center stage, lifted a foot, and extended their arm like a crane's wing, The audience didn't need subtitles. They felt the sorrow. They saw the betrayal. They grieved the exile, the war, the longing. Because Jester is universal. Even a baby knows when a mother pulls away. Even a stranger understands the slump of shame. And that's the miracle of Peking opera. It remembered what modern storytelling often forgets, that truth doesn't need to be explained. It needs to be revealed. So here in the subtle sway of a sleeve, in the coiled energy of a controlled pirouette, lies a secret the soul doesn't scream. It moves. And if we're brave enough to watch closely, we might finally see what our ancestors have been trying to tell us. There is a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels sacred, like a temple with no walls, like a prayer spoken without words. This is the silence of No Japan's most ancient and enigmatic theater form. Developed in the 14th century, No is less about performance and more about presence. Where Western drama builds toward a climax, No peels away illusions until all that's left is the essence of a soul. Imagine a stage almost bare, framed by a simple pine tree. No elaborate backdrop, no shifting scenes. Just the echo of wooden clogs, the haunting whine of a bamboo flute, and the slow, deliberate movements of a figure who seems not to walk, but to drift between worlds. No actors are not trying to entertain. They are inviting you to enter a dream. And in that dream, nothing is rushed. Because in No, time is not linear. It is cyclical, symbolic, suspended. A single step might take 10 seconds. A raised hand might tremble in the air, holding the weight of a lifetime. This slowness isn't laziness, it's devotion. A reverence for every breath, every stillness, every micro-expression that Western eyes might miss. But that's the point. No was never made for those who seek to consume. It was made for those willing to contemplate. At the center of No is the mask, beautiful, rigid, and unchanging. And yet, when worn by a trained actor, the mask comes alive. A slight tilt forward, and the face looks sorrowful. A shift in lighting, and it seems to smile. The No mask does not emote. It invites projection. The emotion isn't forced from the outside. It is evoked from within you. This is perhaps the most radical truth No has to offer. It doesn't show you what to feel. It reflects what you already carry. Where other forms of theater try to fill the space, No empties it until you're alone with yourself. And this too is healing, because in today's world, we are flooded with images, noise, opinions. Everyone is yelling. Few are listening. We've forgotten how to sit in silence long enough to let something real emerge. But No remembers. It teaches us that healing does not always come through catharsis. Sometimes it comes through quiet integration, through allowing something ancient to rise inside you without trying to fix it, label it, or perform it. This is why No often centers on spirits, ghosts of betrayed women, lost warriors, fallen monks. But these ghosts are not villains. They are messengers. They come to teach the living, to mourn the unlived life, to ask for acknowledgement. And that feels familiar, doesn't it? Because maybe inside you, there is also a ghost, a part of you that was silenced, a grief you never voiced, a truth you hid behind your own mask. No doesn't demand that you confess. It only asks that you be still long enough to remember. So what does this tell us about truth? That truth is not always loud. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes truth is the softest thing in the room. The moment before the tears fall. The ache in your chest before the words come. That is the realm of No. It reminds us your deepest self does not speak English. It speaks silence, and silence can be holy. So, the next time you feel lost, overwhelmed, uncertain, don't rush to say something clever. Don't drown it in distraction. Instead, find a quiet room, put your hand on your heart, and listen. Because in that stillness, you may just hear the voice of an old soul yours. When most people hear the word martial arts, they imagine combat punches, flying kicks, landing bodies, colliding. But before martial arts became entertainment, before they became sport or spectacle, they were something deeper, something sacred. Across ancient civilizations, martial arts weren't about violence. They were about discipline, healing, and spiritual transformation. Let's begin in the hot, humid landscapes of southern India, where the ancient martial art of Kalaripayattu was born. Long before the samurai drew their blades, or the Shaolin monks found stillness in motion, warriors in Kerala were mastering not only how to fight, but how to live in harmony with the forces inside them. In Kalari, the body is not an instrument of domination, it is a temple. And training is not just physical, it is ritual. Each session begins with a bow to the earth, an offering of respect to the space, the ancestors, and the body itself. Movements flow, like dance low spiraling precise. And embedded within them is not just self-defense, but a map of energy pressure, points, meridians, breath. Kalari warriors also learned massage and healing, because if you know how to break a body, you must also know how to mend it. This duality, power and mercy, strength and stillness, is what makes true martial arts a paradox. You learn to fight, not to attack, but to understand when not to. Now travel east to the sacred temples of China, where Kung Fu evolved not only as a system of combat, but as a discipline of the soul. At the heart of Kung Fu, especially the Shaolin tradition, is a fusion of movement and Zen philosophy. Every strike is balanced with meditation, every form practiced in silence. The idea was not to conquer others, but to conquer the chaos within. Monks would train for hours, not to become invincible, but to become invisible, dissolving the ego until only presence remained. They believed that every block, every breath, every bow was an expression of inner truth, and that a warrior who cannot control his mind is more dangerous to himself than to any enemy. From India to China, the lesson is the same. Martial arts are not just techniques, they are mirrors. You don't just learn how to strike, you learn what makes you flinch, what makes you rage, what makes you afraid to stand your ground. And if you go even further to Greece, to Nigeria, to Mesoamerica, you find the same idea repeated in different languages. In ancient Greece, the sport of pankration was a brutal blend of boxing and wrestling. But even it was embedded in the Olympic code, an offering to the gods, a test of character as much as of strength. In West Africa, the Hausa people practiced dambe, a ritualized form of boxing, where one arm is wrapped like a weapon and the other left open. Fights were held to honor. Ancestors mark rites of passage and express communal identity, not just individual prowess. And among the Aztecs, martial arts were inseparable from cosmic balance. Warriors trained not only to protect their cities, but to uphold the equilibrium between gods and mortals. Every motion was part of the dance of life and death, sacrifice and rebirth. In each of these traditions, one truth emerges: to master the body is to meet the soul. You can't fake it. You can't skip the steps. Every fall, every bruise, every repetition brings you closer to a version of yourself that is more honest, more disciplined, more whole. And maybe that's what modern life has made us forget: Today we fight with words on screens. We spar with shadows of our own insecurity. But few of us ever sweat enough to meet the sacred silence of a tired, emptied body, that moment after training where all that's left is your breath and your truth. So when you watch an old martial artist move with grace, know this: you're not just seeing muscle memory, you're seeing inner memory, a soul that has been shaped by discipline, humility, and pain. The greatest warrior isn't the one who can destroy. It's the one who chooses not to, because they've already fought the hardest battle, the one within. Martial arts, in their truest form, are not bound by culture or continent. Though the techniques may vary: knees in Thailand, swords in Japan, grapples in Brazil, the soul of the practice remains eerily consistent. It is as if humanity in every corner of the world instinctively knew that the path to inner truth required not just stillness but struggle, not just prayer but pain. Let's begin in Greece, where warriors once worshipped strength like a divine offering. The sport of Pancration, whose name means all powers, was both brutal and sacred. Competitors used fists, feet, elbows, and locks in contests that bordered on life and death. But these weren't mindless brawls. They were offerings. Each match in the ancient Olympics was a performance of character, restraint, and honor. To win was to please the gods. To lose with grace was to please them even more. In this world, strength was never separate from virtue. The body was an altar, and each bruise a form of devotion. Now, travel across the Mediterranean to North and West Africa, where the martial spirit lived in Dambengolo and Layamb. In Nigeria, Dambe emerged among the Hausa as a martial dance of fists and open hands. One arm would be wrapped tight, hardened with rope, and sometimes soaked in resin or ash. The other arm stayed free, used for balance, for grace, for strategy. But this wasn't simply a fight. It was ritual. Matches happened at harvests, festivals, rites of passage. Drums would beat in rhythm with each jab. Spectators formed a circle, not just to watch, but to witness the transformation of a boy into a man, a fighter into a symbol. Over in Senegal, lamb, a form of wrestling, took on almost mythical stature. Fighters covered themselves in sand-tied, gris-gris protective charms to their limbs and invoked the spirits of ancestors before stepping into the arena. There were no belts, no rankings, no belts, only pride, heritage, and the echo of every warrior who had fought before them. And then far away in time and space, in the jungles of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, the Aztecs and Maya trained not only for war, but for cosmic duty. In Aztec culture, warriors weren't just fighters. They were sacred instruments in a world where balance between light and darkness, chaos and order, was fragile and must be constantly renewed. Combat training began early, often in the Telpachkali, a kind of warrior school for boys. But students didn't just learn how to hold a spear. They learned humility, discipline, astronomy, and ritual. Because battle wasn't about domination, it was about cosmic offering. The ultimate act of sacrifice wasn't taking life, but offering your own in service of the gods. To fall in battle was to rise in the afterlife. Among the Inca training included endurance rituals at high altitudes, where the thin air forced a warrior to meet not just his limits, but his ancestors. In the Andes, where gods lived in mountains and spirits rode the wind martial, strength was never separate from spiritual awareness. What unites all these forms, whether it was a Greek pancratiast in the sun-drenched stadiums of Olympia, a Senegalese wrestler before a roaring village crowd, or an Aztec boy training for his first battle under a blood-red sky, the story is the same. The body was a tool of transformation. The fight was a sacred test, and the ultimate enemy was always internal. Modern combat sports often miss this truth. We see knockouts, we track wins and losses, but we rarely ask, what does this say about the human soul? Ancient martial arts tell us something different. They remind us that pain can be a form of prayer, that discipline is a form of freedom, and that power is meaningless without wisdom. They teach us that no matter where we come from, we all carry a battlefield inside us, a struggle between fear and courage, ego and humility, destruction and creation. And when we fight with grace, whether in the ring in life or in the quiet spaces of the self, we honor something larger than ourselves. We honor the ancestors who trained under stars and sweat through rituals. We honor the cultures that believed strength should never be separated from soul. And maybe, just maybe, we learn to live not as conquerors, but as guardians of something sacred within. So, the next time you hear the word martial arts, remember this. It's not about who hits hardest. It's about who listens deepest to the silence after the hit, to the truth within the bruise, and to the warrior within who is still learning to bow. What if the one everyone mocked was the only one telling the truth? Throughout history, those who saw too clearly were not crowned prophets. They were branded fools, heretics, mad women, or simply forgotten, not because they were wrong, but because they said what no one wanted to hear, because they refused to look away from the rot beneath the gold or the cracks in the marble smile of power. And that is unforgivable. Let us return once more to the court jester. He was never meant to be powerful. He didn't command armies or hold titles, but he had one devastating weapon, the ability to make people laugh at themselves. In a world of fear and censorship, that was revolutionary, but it was also dangerous, because laughter has memory, and once the veil is pierced, it cannot be unpierced. The fool could make the king laugh at his own hypocrisy, but if the laughter lingered too long, or the joke struck too close to the truth, that same fool might fall ill the next morning, or vanish entirely. One day, a curiosity the next day, a cautionary tale. But why? Because the fool was not just mocking power. He was reminding it that everyone is mortal, that the emperor, no matter how divine he claimed to be, would one day die, just like the cripple with bells on his shoes. That is a truth too heavy for some thrones to bear, and yet the fool endured, not just as a court figure, but as an archetype across time in Shakespeare's Lear, in the tarot deck, in spiritual traditions where the clown is often a holy messenger disguised in absurdity. Carl Jung once wrote that the fool is the precursor to the savior, because the fool is the first to say, "This isn't working," even if no one is ready to hear it. And just as fools bore truth through mockery, some women bore truth through power and were crushed for it. Sinena and Uretissier didn't die because they failed. They died because they succeeded in a world built to pretend they couldn't. Their names were carved into no great monuments. Their battles weren't sung in the heroic epics. But in their silence, in their erasure, lies a different kind of truth. That when women lead without apology, when they wear armor instead of silence, when they refuse to bow for comfort, they awaken fear, not celebration, and fear is the most faithful ally of erasure. But history has ghosts, and ghosts remember. So today we remember them the fool and the fighter, not as victims but as mirrors. The jester for every time you laughed through your own exhaustion just to be accepted. Sinane for every time you were punished for being too bold, too loud, too good. Uratishi for every time you were told you're too much when in truth you were finally enough. Because truth, real truth, doesn't come wearing a crown. It comes limping, it comes screaming, it comes in whispers behind closed doors. It comes in dreams you don't understand but can't forget. It comes dressed as a fool or born as a girl in the wrong century. It comes as silence you can't explain, and then one day it speaks. So the next time you see someone laughed at, dismissed, or erased, ask yourself, what truth did they carry that the world was too afraid to hold? And the next time you feel like a fool, maybe you're not lost. Maybe you're on the right path. The path where only fools and ghosts dare to walk. The path that leads not to applause, but to truth. And tonight, maybe, that's all we were ever trying to remember. In every grand hall, gilded with gold beneath the vaulted ceilings, echoing with lies disguised as praise, there stood one figure who was never quite welcome, but never quite absent either. He stood crooked, colorful, and out of place, as if reality had glitched inside the polished theater of power. The jester. He wasn't there to flatter. He wasn't there to bow. He was there to reflect, not with flattery, not with threats, but with a mirror, a terrible, brilliant mirror, held up in the form of a joke. You laugh at the fool, the old saying goes, until you realize he understands you better than you'd like. Because that's the thing about jesters. They never just made fun of themselves. They made fun of you, of your vanity, of your delusions, of your hypocrisy wrapped in ritual. And they did it while ringing bells on their sleeves and smiling like they didn't know better. But they always knew better. The jester was a mirror, not just for kings, but for all of us. He showed us the face we refuse to see in our own reflection, the weary mask of performance, the silent scream hidden behind the smile, the exhaustion beneath the applause, the fear beneath the armor. He danced so we didn't have to admit we were crumbling. He made jokes so we didn't have to face our grief. He exaggerated absurdities so we could pretend they weren't real. But every mirror has a cost. To be the one who reflects you must carry what others deny. You become the sponge of pain, the punchline of truth. And no one wants to keep the mirror around once they've seen too much. That's why so many jesters disappeared. That's why their names were rarely written in stone. They were tolerated until they weren't. They were beloved until they said something that hit too close. They were clowns until they became prophets. And the world has never been kind to prophets. Look at our modern times. Don't we still laugh at those who speak from pain too openly? Don't we still call people dramatic or attention-seeking when they dare to show us the truth we'd rather not see? Don't we shame those who fall apart as if we ourselves are made of stone? Every society still has its fools. Every generation still breaks its mirrors. And every soul at some point becomes a jester, especially those who carry too much feeling in a world that rewards numbness. Maybe you've been one yourself. Maybe you've made others laugh while silently dying inside. Maybe you've hidden your exhaustion behind bright clothes, louder voices, bigger gestures. Maybe you've noticed things others pretend not to see and paid the price for naming them. If so, let me say this. You are not broken. You are a mirror, and that is sacred, because the fool sees what no one dares to name. The fool tells the emperor he is naked. The fool is the only one left speaking when everyone else is performing. And yes, the fool often sleeps alone, but it is better to sleep alone in truth than to be embraced in illusion. So tonight, if you've ever been laughed at for your tenderness, dismissed for your insight, mocked for your difference, remember this. The jester was not just a joke. He was a warning and a gift. He reminded the powerful that nothing lasts. He reminded the weary that they are not alone. He reminded all of us that behind every throne stands a man in bells, holding up the truth we refuse to look at. They didn't die because they failed. They died because they succeeded too well. History has always struggled with women who wielded power not as ornaments of royalty, but as forces of will. Women who didn't smile politely while being erased, but instead walked into battle wearing armor, not metaphorical, but forged of steel. Women like Sinane and Eurydice. Their names are barely whispered in the annals of Macedonia. You won't find them in popular textbooks or heroic statues, but they existed, and that in itself was dangerous. Sinane was not a queen of silk and softness. She was a commander, a daughter of royalty, trained not to marry for alliance, but to conquer for legacy. She led armies. She spoke to men not as decoration, but as equal, and she dared to believe she could shape the fate of an empire. She wasn't murdered in disgrace. She was assassinated at her peak because her very success made her intolerable. And Eurydice, her daughter, was even more terrifying to the world that tried to mold her. Trained by Sinane, Eurydice was not simply born royal, she was built to reign. She studied politics like men studied war. She stood before soldiers not as muse, but as general. She wore the crown like a blade. And when she finally took power, it wasn't as a puppet, it was as a sovereign. That's when they demanded her silence, not for what she said, but for the power she embodied. Because a woman who commands, not seduces, not submits, not pleads, breaks the script that keeps the empire balanced. They couldn't defeat her in battle, so they defeated her in history, forced into suicide, erased from memory. A queen burned not for her sins, but for her strength. And what does that tell us? That sometimes the world will not punish you for being wrong. It will punish you for being undeniable, for being too loud, too capable, too unwilling to bow where others knelt. Sinane and Eurydice were not destroyed because they threatened the realm. They were destroyed because they threatened the narrative. Because if women like them could rule, lead, and win, what excuse did the rest of the empire have for keeping others silent? That's the curse of power that doesn't apologize. It invites admiration and assassination, and yet their names are being spoken again. Their stories are rising not in marble, but in memory. And in that, there is resurrection. Because power that is erased does not disappear. It lingers in the bones of every girl who dares to raise her voice. It haunts the throne rooms of men who think their legacy is safe. And tonight, as we remember the jesters who told the truth and the women who lived it, we must ask, what kind of world do we want to build? One that punishes strength and rewards silence, or one that finally listens to the voices it once erased? The fool, the queen, the warrior, the forgotten, they all have one thing in common. They told the truth when no one else dared. Not the convenient truth, not the sanitized version, but the kind of truth that makes rooms go silent, the kind that peels away illusion like rotting wallpaper, the kind that costs you everything but leaves your soul intact. Sometimes truth wears bells. Sometimes truth wears armor. Sometimes truth wears a woman's voice in a man's world. And more often than not, truth is the one thing no one wants to hear until it's too late. We laughed at the jester. We silenced the queen. We exiled the mirror, then wondered why we can no longer see ourselves clearly. But here's what they never tell you. The jester's laughter was never just a joke. It was a warning. The queen's sword was never just for war. It was for dignity. And the stories that were buried, they were never really dead. They live in the cracks of our culture, in the unease we feel when someone speaks too freely, when a woman stands too tall, when someone different refuses to bow. So, if you've ever felt unseen, unheard too much, too intense, too aware, maybe you're carrying their legacy. Maybe you're the next jester, the next forgotten queen, the next dangerous truth wrapped in soft skin, and maybe, just maybe, the world needs what you carry more than it knows. Because history doesn't only live in books, it lives in the hearts of those who refuse to forget. And if you're still here, listening to stories that were never meant to survive, feeling chills where others only felt indifference, then you are not just an audience. You are the resurrection. So before we end this journey, take a breath. Take a look at the world you live in and ask yourself, where are the jesters today? Who's speaking truth beneath a mask? And are we ready to finally listen? If you've ever felt like you had to smile when your heart was breaking, stay quiet when you knew the truth, or shrink yourself to fit into someone else's story, you're not alone, and you're not broken. The world has always punished those who carry inconvenient truths. The jester was forced to laugh. The queen was forced to die, not because they were wrong, but because they saw too clearly, loved too fiercely, and refused to pretend. You don't need a stage or a crown to live with that kind of courage. Sometimes simply speaking up is revolutionary. Sometimes not abandoning yourself is the greatest act of defiance. So, when the world tries to costume you, silence you, or rewrite your worth, remember this: truth doesn't die. It just waits for someone brave enough to live it again. And maybe that someone is you.